Everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Then, yeah, let me and Eugene present our solution, which we happily achieved first place on this competition. So I'm Christoph Henkel and Eugene. That's the agenda. We quickly give some introduction, quickly recap the competition itself, talking a bit about the challenges of this competition, and then go through our solution and finish with some ablation study. So I'm Christoph Henkel. I work at NVIDIA as a deep learning data scientist. I'm also part of NVIDIA's KGMON team, which is a specific team of Kaggle grandmasters at NVIDIA. My background is in mathematics, where I have a PhD, and I'm currently ranked #1 overall in competitions on Kaggle.
You want me to have some words for me, Christoph?
Yeah, you can introduce yourself.
I'm Eugene. I also work at NVIDIA and on Kaggle Grandmaster batch. Currently, with the winning of this competition, I jumped to the top 50. Work as a computer science. I made some open source projects in the past, and I'm happy to share our winning solution to that challenge. Back to you, Christoph.
Yeah, so a quick overview of the competition. I guess everybody knows. So the task was to detect 5 different particles, where in the training data set we actually have 6 particles annotated. The training data only was 7 tomographs, which is very, very little, but test data set was around 500. Metric everybody should be familiar with, and I think the main challenges in this competition was like the low signal to noise ratio, the very small training data set, the runtime restriction, especially since the test data is so large. For us as competitors, it was quite an unknown domain with specific things you needed to learn and to adjust your methodologies to. And in general, the objects were very, very small compared to a large 3D image. And I just took one illustrative image on the right, where you can see how small the objects actually are. So we always start with like cross-validation when joining a Kaggle competition. For this competition, it was straightforward, just to split by experiment, so by tomograph. So we had 7 folds overall. And by this, we had quite some good correlation between our local cross-validation and the public leaderboard. And because the public leaderboard had a lot of sample, I was quite confident that every improvement on that was also we saw on public leaderboard might reflect to the private part. One thing that was a bit challenging that because the training data set was so small, there was quite some volatility in our validation scores. So if you perform the same experiment twice or 3 times in a row with different seeds, you get quite some volatile results, which makes optimizing a solution a little bit tricky. One trick we found that helped us in this regard was to use TTA, so test time augmentation, while doing the validation. That reduced a little bit the volatility. So let me start with my part of the solution. As you might know, our solution in general is like a 50-50 combination of a segmentation approach, which was worked on by myself, and an object detection approach, which Eugene worked on. We joined our solutions quite late in the competition, I think like 3 weeks before end or 2 weeks before end. So we worked on our individual part quite individually. So let me start with introducing my part of the solution, which was focusing on a segmentation approach. So I found that for me, a tile size or a patch size of 96 by 96 by 96 is optimal. So from each of the 3D images, you crop those 96 shaped cubes, and you put them through a partly unit, where the unit itself comes from the Monai framework. I used 2 different encoders, which were quite small. I think that's something we saw, that a very small encoder works really well, and large encoders tend to overfit. So I used ResNet 34 and some efficient net for diversity. 2 things that make my segmentation approach stand out from others that were quite popular on Kaggle. One thing is that I didn't use the very last layer, but I cut off 1 layer before. So the output only has a shape of 48 by 48 by 48, which was enough to predict then the targets. And the second thing is that what was quite popular was to use those Gaussian balls as annotation, and then use some non-maximum suppression to end up with single points as predictions. What I found is that if I use 1 layer before, so it's like just half the size, you can actually use single pixel loss or single pixels as targets, and use a simple cross entropy loss with just some heavy weight on the foreground pixels. So you basically downweight the background by a factor of 256. And this really helps to steer the models toward the actual problem, and not to spend too much effort in predicting those Gaussian balls and getting those Gaussian balls right. What was also popular in the literature, and I also tried this, was using deep supervision, meaning you not only predict the target on this layer, but you also predict the targets on the bottom layers. And by this, help the model guide through like a better flow of predictions, basically, through the unit. It didn't help significantly, but it provided some diversity for my part of the ensemble. For pre-processing, I used standard normalization. So you just take a tomograph and subtract mean and divide by standard deviation. And as core augmentations, I used a random crop of those 96 cubes, flipping and rotating, all from the Monai package, and use mix-up to really utilize the 7 tomographs we had and mix them together. Any questions so far?
Yes. Can I ask, is you have this 96 cube as input, that, it's the same for all the 6 species proteins?
Yes. So the input is 96 by 96 by 96. And the output is basically 48 by 48 by 48 times 6. So I also predict the 6th target, which is not scored. Or even it's like times 7, because I also predict a background class, but this is then not used at the end.
Did you run any ablations on mix-up? I'm just curious, like how much the different augmentations helped.
For me, mix-up helped a lot. For Eugene, it didn't help. I think for me, it really helped in training longer epochs. And since for this specific kind of problem, you really can't use, or I did not use any pre-trained weights. So since you basically train a model from scratch using randomly initiated weights, training longer helps in general getting better weights at the end. And all augmentations techniques that help you train longer at the end improved my model, and their mix-up was like a key ingredient for me. But I also saw Eugene as well as other people writing that mix-up did not help for them. Maybe because they pre-trained on simulated data or for other reasons, but I trained from scratch, and their mix-up helped a lot.
Thanks. Another question, just hyperparameter optimization. I'm just wondering how you did searches. Was it manual or?
More or less manual. So I always try to avoid early stopping, for example. So always first tune basically learning rate and number of epochs. And as soon as I have a baseline from this, I start step by step changing one knob at a time. So adding more regularization or trying a different augmentation. Yeah, that's how I normally deal with this. So I start training with a baseline and then change one thing at a time. And I always look at if I'm rather overfitting or underfitting, and then adjust knobs related to that, I would say.
One question. So for the weighted cross-entropy loss, how did you determine the 1/256 like scalar, the background?
Yeah, that was a mixture of the number of pixels you have in the cube as foregrounds and backgrounds. Just to get a rough indication of the scale. And then also use this as a hyperparameter. So I also tried 64 or 512 and 256 was the best. But as initially for the scale itself, I basically calculated how many foreground pixels you have from the classes, how many background pixels you have, and then use this as a starting point, basically, to have a somewhat evenly weighted loss at the end.
Justin has a question.
Yeah, I have a question. Could you explain again, maybe some more intuition for why you're not using the last 96 by 96 by 96 block in your UNet? Just curious to know why you kind of truncated it.
Yeah. So it actually came out by accident, so to say. So I was experimenting with deep supervision and evaluating the quality of each feature map as a prediction individually, just to see if I can somehow ensemble the different feature maps. So building like a combination of them. And then I saw that the penultimate layer gives the highest accuracy, and I was quite curious about this. And then I also realized that if I cut off the last one, which has roughly the same quality as the penultimate one, the model overfits much less because you just have like less features, so to say, to predict. And this really helped at the end. So it was like starting as an accident, but then I followed through why the different layers are behaving differently. And I also saw that the second last layer was really good for the very large particles, like a virus and another one. So that's why deep supervision was like helpful, because the 24 by 24 was very good on like the two very large particles. Yeah. But at the end, I think it comes down to overfitting less. That's like the main benefit at the end of the day, I would say.
So do you use any up scaling to basic upscale from deep layers back to the targets?
You mean for the very final prediction?
Yes.
Yeah, we will talk about this on the next slides, because I actually will then combine my predictions with the prediction from Eugene's model, which are also more or less by coincidence on this 48 by 48 by 48 output. So that's a lucky coincidence that we anyway have like the same output, and then we just multiply the predictions by a factor of 2 at the end.
Do you have any comments about the loss function, and if cross entropy had a major advantage over, say, like focal loss or diversity loss?
For me, focal and Tversky loss did not work really well. I got a lot of like nans and other kind of things. For me, definitely cross entropy was better than binary cross entropy. I think because the model learns to differentiate better between particles. And especially, I don't know the names exactly. There were like two particles which are very similar, I would say, for the model. So the sixth one, which is not actually scored, and some other one like beta amylase and beta gala something. And using cross entropy really helped the model to differentiate between those two. So there I saw a really huge benefit. Vogel and Tversky, I did not really have success in trying them. I also tried dice loss, which when I was using those Gaussian balls, which helped the model to converge faster, but at the end it did not really add some benefit. So I experimented with losses, and for me, like this weighted cross entropy was like the best one. Any more questions?
I don't know if we have time. I have one more. I was just wondering the test time augmentation. Is that just for your local validation or also for the test on Kaggle server?
I do some kind of test time augmentation also for the Kaggle server, but I also will talk about this on the next slide.
Okay.
Or on like two slides ahead or so.
Go for it, yeah.
Okay, let's go to the object detection part, which will be presented by Eugene.
Thank you. So, as Christoph mentioned, yeah, we have two quite diverse approaches in our final solution. And I approached this challenge from the object detection standpoint, where I repurposed the YOLO-like approach from the classical bounding box detection to the task of detecting points in a 3D space. For that reason, I adjusted the Monai feature encoders, which was then combined together with the classical object detection head that predicts 6 classes for the object presence in a given spatial location, and the offset to account for the fact that we usually, when we're doing object detection, we predict object in the smaller strides, not in the original resolution of the input. And for the stride, I use the stride of 2, meaning that my prediction class map is 2 times smaller than the input, which aligns with the Christoph's segmentation models, which eventually make it way easier for us to blend our predictions. But my line of thinking of using stride 2 was that it is really slow to predict in a stride 2. I was getting almost 2x.
You just muted your
Yeah, sorry. I was saying that by using stride 2, the model can predict 2 times faster compared to using the full resolution inference with stride 1. But surprisingly, the accuracy with a stride 2 doesn't drop at all, which led me thinking that we lose most of the points, not because we detect points inaccurate, but because we misclassify them. And because of that, we can actually do stride 4. And I did this ablation, and stride 4 still looks really, really well in terms of accuracy. We lose 1 or 2% of the accuracy if you use stride 4, but this makes the detection model way, way faster. But for the sake of the competing, stride 2 was kind of optimal solution, since it's a good balance between the accuracy and the speed. So I used stride 2, and I trained on big tiles. and I used the SegresNet and DynamicUNet backbones from Monai library as well for this 3D point detection approach. So, and for the training, I took random crops or semi-random crops, meaning that the crop around each particle instance from the whole slice, and it was randomly scaled and rotated along all axes to generate unique and diverse training samples. And that was prevented overfitting quite well. And that was it as for the augmentations. For the object detection approach, I found that mix-up didn't work for me, which I was really surprised to observe. Usually for all past object detection challenges I participated, the mix-up was a way to go. But here, for some reason, it didn't work. My assumption is that given a small set of the training data, I could easily miss the spot of where this mix-up actually provides a best checkpoint. Because of our validation scheme, we only validate on one volume, and it's quite noisy estimate. Should we have, let's say, 100 of slices in our training set where we can dedicate 10 or 20 slices for the validation, it would be way more robust estimate where we can make some justified conclusions whether one approach works or not. In this competition, only the leaderboard was a more or less robust indicator of whether ensemble is good or not. Anyhow, no mix-up in this ensemble for the object detection part. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so to train the object detection model, I repurposed the YOLO approach, and the loss function itself is quite novel. So the idea is that we drop the notion of the bounding boxes, and we use the point, the center of the particle, as our target. And for the distance metrics, we use the RU score from the pose estimation task, which is just the negative exponent of the square distance between the ground truth point and the predicted point. And then we use the varifocal loss to train the classification head for that. This gives the class map that looks really, really similar to the segmentation predictions from Christoph. Essentially, we predict just the point where the center of each particle is. And all we have to do is simply average segmentation predictions with the detection prediction map. There is a small nuance that our predictions is slightly non-calibrated one to another, and Christoph will explain how we did the ensembling in the next slide. But as for the post-processing, it's quite simple. First, we do so-called center net NMS, which is simply max pooling with the kernel size of 3 by 3 by 3 across the class map. This suppresses the near identical, near duplicate detections. And then we simply take top K candidates per each class, and we do greedy NMS on that candidates, and do the threshold filtering, which filters particles with individual threshold per its class. And that's how we do the final predictions. And of course, we then just multiply it by 2 to account for the fact that we do the predictions in the stride of 2. That's for the object detection. Any questions on that part?
I have a question on the previous slide. The augmentation you were doing with the scaling, is that just expanding or shrinking the crop?
It's a scaling of the crop. So essentially, I modify the physics and I make the particle either bigger or smaller. I know it's contrary to the nature of the object, because one particle cannot be smaller because it's a fixed RNA structure. But what I found, it's prevent the overfitting. So
I actually think it's very cool because as things get smaller, they look more and more like each other. So if you can find a way to, train it to not confuse them. I guess I'm just curious how much this helps with the smaller particles. Did you
I should have the experiment log in my repository where I did some dose ablations, and I believe should be some numbers on that. But since it made to the final solution, makes me think that yes, indeed, it was helpful. So I kept it, as well as the rotations. So I rotate not only through the z-axis, but also for the x and y-axis by smaller margin. And it also helped model to generalize better, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Christoph, I think you can go to the unsampling slide.
Yeah. So we know that we had very good individual solutions. So each part would score 5th place or so individually. But when we combine both, we then move from 5th place to 1st place at the end. One problem we encountered, which Eugene mentioned, was that since we have very different approaches, the overall scale of our predictions is quite different. And there's one picture here, and let me quickly explain what this shows. So I think the blue predictions are from Eugene's approach, and the orange one are from my approach, meaning that you take all the output pixels and you just flatten out and do a histogram of all the values you get. So all the predicted values you put in a single histogram, and then you see that my approach basically predicts way lower values in general, and Eugene's model predicts way higher values in general, which are also more spread out. Showing this zoomed in an actual example, the left one is predictions from Eugene's approach. The middle one is predictions from my approach. And you can see that the localization of the objects and particles is really consistent, but the intensity is quite different. So Eugene has way higher intensity values. So I experimented a lot with how we can make both heat maps and predictions consistent and align them. And what I found is that if you do a histogram matching or rank scaling, however you call it, so basically making both histograms aligned with each other by forcing the predictions to have the same quantiles and rankings, this really helps to combine both solutions. So I take the intensities coming from Eugene's predictions, I scale up my predictions with those intensities, and the result is basically this image, which is basically my localization, but with higher intensities. And by this, we can really align the histograms and blend our output feature maps before doing the object detection post-processing. Any questions on this before I do some note on sliding window inference? Okay. Yeah, so one thing we also found, which I think is quite interesting to see, is that what we did, and I think most of the teams did something like this, where you basically divide the whole tomograph into overlapping patches and feed the overlapping patches into your model, we saw that the way how you do the patching and how you do the overlaps matters quite a lot, I would say. And we used a different tiling approach. So Eugene invented or used his own tiling approach, where you basically preset the number of tiles you want to have. And then you equally distribute the tiles over your input volume. And you can see that with different settings, you get a different tiling pattern. And let me quickly explain this tiling pattern. So what I plot here is basically the number of times single pixels are fed to the model. Sorry. Single pixels are fed to the model. So meaning that, for example, in this image, the yellow ones, those pixels are coming from different patches which overlap at those single points more often. And those single pixels then at the end of the day are fed more often to the models. And as a result, if you then average all your overlapping predictions pixel-wise, those have like higher number of predictions that are averaged at the end of the day. So what I want to say at the end of the day is that how homogeneous those images look like matters quite a lot. And now coming back to the TTA we were discussing. So if I was using the tiling, which is built into Monai, which does like where you specify a patch size and an overlap, and then it basically goes through your input image, doing the patching, and whatever is left, it just like shifts the last patch so it fits into your volume. It actually looks like this, which is quite inhomogeneous. And by using TTA, so by using the flip augmentation, you can basically get an image like this, which looks like more homogeneous. So this means that for my approach, the benefit from test time augmentation is not coming from the augmentation itself, but from having a more homogeneous tiling at the end of the day. That's one thing I found quite interesting. And we saw in our solution. I don't know if anybody else looked at this.
Chris, I'm sorry, I don't think I understood. What was the issue? What did you see artifacts or?
Yeah,
do you see improvements in performance when you do it more homogeneous?
It's a bit tricky to explain. So if you do it more homogeneously, like I would say something optimal is the image on the left. That's like the more or less optimal image. This gives the highest leaderboard score because you get like a more homogeneous map of predictions, and those predictions are also like on the same scale. Whereas in this image, or even in those images, the pixels in those regions, which are really, really yellow, so they have a lot of predictions and they averaged more often at the end of the day. The overall prediction, predictions are less homogeneous and then have less accurate at the end of the day.
I can quickly step in and try to share my understanding. So the idea of doing this overlapping inference is to reduce the variance of the predictions by averaging more and more predictions. And with this tiling, when we have inhomogeneous this grid, we have this uneven variance reduction, so to say. And this makes the final scores worse. While having more or less homogeneous variance reduction leads to the higher final leaderboard score.
So does that mean when you do this in the overlapping areas, they are all systematically get a higher inference score? Why is that?
Sorry, can you repeat?
So it's on this. Is the yellow color means it's a low prediction score or it's a high prediction score?
No, the yellow color has nothing to do with the prediction score. The yellow color means that those regions are just averaged more often than other regions because they are more often in different patches, basically.
So, one question. So, like, when you do the stitching using like Gaussian weighting or those kinds of weighting is supposed to alleviate this kind of issue, right? But
yeah, but this has a very minor effect. Those solves, I checked on this because when I first showed to Eugene, he had the same argument that Gaussian stitching should reduce this, but you still see the same pattern. And I think the problem is that you still, through the whole volume, you had like, as Eugene mentioned, inhomogeneous reduction of variance. That's the whole point. And those regions, which are yellow here, are averaged more, which at the end of the day pushes down the predictions a little bit. So some regions are more pushed down than others, and your predictions are just like less homogeneous. And at the end, for the whole volume, you get like a lower accuracy.
But again,
because at the very end of the models, you do the thresholding to determine if a particle is picked or not, which really depends on the absolute value of your predictions. And if the values of your predictions are not homogeneous through the volume, those thresholding can't be done like optimally.
I really love this discussion. Am I the only one concerned about time there? Is Meg, Kristen managing time, or is no one managing time? We have 4 presentations, right? But this is a great discussion. I don't want to cut it off. But Maggie, are you managing the time or who is?
Well, I think that because this is the first place competition, I was letting this one run a little bit long.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah.
Great, thanks, Maggie.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit tricky because it's nowhere stated in the literature as far as I know. And it's a little bit tricky to explain because it's not a usual topic to discuss. But I hope you got like the overall idea.
very useful, thank you.
Did you have another question, Phil?
Yeah, I was wondering if you can calibrate this using the background where there's no particles in place.
What do you mean?
So that you can use the patches you choose intentionally on the in the tomogram without the particles occupancy. So you use this. Can you get the calibrations of how much is over predict or is
Sorry,
I'm actually not sure that this would help, since this overlapping is a function of your study size and the amount of overlap you want to have. So it's not depends on the input data, mostly on how much you would like to spend on overlapping. Since the conclusion is that the more tiles you have, generally the better accuracy you get, but you pay for this with the time. When we started trying different number of tiles, we saw that for some reason with the 10 tiles we get worse score than for the 9 tiles. And then Christoph started analyzing this and visualized this pattern of a tiling where we saw this really uneven structure, which then led to this analysis and our conclusion.
Thank you.
Just really quickly before you wrap up, I'm very curious to know if you guys have thought about like various patch sizes. Like in particular, I'm wondering if you have some intuition on how large the patch size could be. You know, back in the sort of UNet design, you kind of mentioned by extracting the 48 or 40, I'm not sure if it's 46 by 46 instead of 96 by 96, it seems more robust, it seems less overfitting. So then I'm wondering, you know, why not just train a UNet that takes in, let's say, 48 by 48 patches? Now you can do more, I guess you can slide more, you can do more averages. I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I experimented a lot with like patch sizes. And before I joined with Eugene, my solution was actually on an ensemble with like different patch sizes. So like models trained on different patch sizes, and those ensemble really well. And that's because the patch sizes is like a trade-off between, if the patch size is really large, you get less border artifacts, which helps your model. But you also tend to overfit very, very quicker because you just give the models more features. And if you have a very small patch size, then you get a lot of border artifacts, and you get a lot of cases in your training where you have just like half a particle on the borders, and it makes like training way harder. But it's also very difficult to overfit. So there's definitely the trade-off of the patch sizes. And for me, 96 cubes was like the optimal point. Okay, then let me continue. We only have like 1 or 2 more slides, I guess. So yeah, at the end of the day, as mentioned, we had like our 2 different approaches. We did like sliding window inference on both. We used different tools for speeding up the inference. So Eugene used converting the models to an Onyx graph and then used TensorRT for inference, which boosted up the inference speed a lot. Then rearranged to like this 2-stride output. I used JIT as an expert and using half precision. I also used TTA and averaged all my predictions, then rearranged to the same shape. We did this rank scale of my predictions to align with Eugene's predictions. And then we simply averaged both worlds and ran the object detection post-processing on this before doing class-dependent thresholds, where the thresholds were calculated on CV, where we basically draw curves of optimal thresholds of the 7 different folds, and then took the optimal point of each curve. I think this slide is self-explaining, but maybe Eugene want to say a few words on the TensorRT inference.
Yeah, definitely was a key role in fitting all our models into the time limit of this competition, given the big number of the studies we had to process. We started with a eager PyTorch, which was nowhere near to the final speed up we got with the TensorRT. There was a couple of hiccups, mostly because of the Monai support of the exporting models to Onyx. But once they were sorted out, we was able to export final ensemble as an Onyx file and build the TensorRT engine on top of that. And we use this FP16 precision on the T4 for inferencing, which allowed us to fit all our models that we want into the final ensemble. So yeah, if you decide to deploy any of the models, yeah, I highly suggest to use the TensorRT.
Yeah, and here you can basically see that both our approaches had like individually roughly the same score. So Eugene has like 10 checkpoints, and the ensemble got like this score. I used 6 checkpoints, so 3 different models plus 2 seeds. I used TTA. Averaged them. I got like a very similar score. Combining both improved a lot. And then by using this scaling approach, we pushed up even more. And then there was like a slide trick where for the object detection, you basically need to predict not only the output feature map, but you also predict an offset value where it shifts the pixel values by a slight value. And not using any offsets of 0 for my model. So just like weighting the offsets, which were predicted by the object detection model, gave another small boost. And this was the resulting of our total leaderboard score.
I now wonder that if you do add 0.5 as your default offset, I think it should boost predictions even more. But
yeah. Then some insights we gained what did not work. So large models did not work simply because training data was small and you're overfitting quite easily. Transformers did not work. I think that's because no global context within the image is needed for particle detection, but only like local information is important. I didn't get any benefit from using simulated data, neither the one available in the data portal, nor using some self-simulated data. Also pre-trained CryoEM models, meaning models that were trained on 2D data, did not help. Other augmentations did not help. 2.5D models, which means you basically take a 2D model and somehow model the z-axis by average pooling or some other custom pooling, did not help. And then for the object detection part, 3D versions of ConfNext and HRNet, which are quite popular, I would say, did not work. And as Eugene mentioned, that mix-up and copy-paste augmentation did not work for him either. And that leads us to final questions, if there are any.